The silence of the Hindu Kush Mountains was shattered by the deafening roar of MH-47 Chinook helicopters cutting through the freezing night air. It was October 19, 2001, and the first boots of the United States military were touching down on Afghan soil. These men belonged to the elite Green Berets, and they carried with them the weight of a grieving nation seeking justice. Just weeks prior, the skyline of New York City had been permanently altered by the attacks of September 11th. Now these soldiers found themselves thousands of miles from home, in a land known historically as the graveyard of empires. They were the vanguard of Operation Enduring Freedom, and their mission was to dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban regime that harbored them. The stakes could not have been higher for the United States and its allies as the dust settled in lower Manhattan. President George Walker Bush had issued an ultimatum to the Taliban leadership demanding the surrender of Osama bin Laden. When the Taliban refused, the machinery of war began to turn with terrifying speed. The objective was clear, but the path to victory was shrouded in the fog of a complex tribal society. This was not a war against a conventional standing army, but a fight against a shadowy network of terrorists entrenched in one of the most rugged landscapes on Earth. The world watched with bated breath, wondering if the United States would succeed where the British Empire and the Soviet Union had previously failed. Central to the initial strategy was the alliance with the Northern Alliance, a coalition of Afghan fighters who had been resisting the Taliban for years. United States Special Forces teams like Tiger 02 were inserted to coordinate airstrikes and lead cavalry charges against Taliban strongholds. The image of American soldiers riding on horseback alongside Afghan mujahideen became a defining symbol of this early phase. With precision-guided munitions falling from the sky, the Taliban lines began to crumble rapidly. Cities like Mazar-i-Sharif fell within weeks, and the momentum seemed unstoppable. It appeared that a swift victory was within reach, as the Taliban fighters retreated south toward the Pakistani border and the mountainous Tora Bora region. By mid-November 2001, the capital city of Kabul had been liberated from Taliban rule, prompting celebrations in the streets. Men shaved their beards and women removed their burqas for the first time in years, expressing a tentative hope for the future. The swift collapse of the Taliban regime surprised many military analysts who had predicted a long and bloody winter campaign. However, the leadership of al-Qaeda, including Osama bin Laden, had not yet been captured. Intelligence reports indicated that they were regrouping in the cave complexes of Tora Bora. This rugged terrain would prove to be the first major test for the United States military and a pivotal moment that would shape the next 2 decades of conflict. The Battle of Tora Bora in December 2001 remains one of the most controversial episodes of the entire war. United States Special Forces and local Afghan militias pounded the mountains with massive airstrikes, including the use of daisy cutter bombs. Despite the overwhelming firepower, the difficult terrain and reliance on local proxies allowed Osama bin Laden to slip across the border into Pakistan. This escape transformed what could have been a decisive end to the conflict into a protracted manhunt. The failure to capture the al-Qaeda leader meant that the primary justification for the invasion remained unfulfilled. It was a tactical victory, but a strategic failure that would haunt the American command for years. With the Taliban regime toppled, the international community turned its attention to the daunting task of nation building. In December 2001, the Bonn Agreement established an interim authority led by Hamid Karzai. The goal was to create a stable democratic government that would never again allow terrorists to operate from Afghan soil. The United States and its NATO allies established the International Security Assistance Force to provide security in Kabul. Optimism was high, but the challenges were immense in a country shattered by decades of continuous war. The infrastructure was non-existent, and the tribal divisions ran deep beneath the surface of the new political order. As 2002 dawned, the focus of the United States began to shift toward a potential conflict in Iraq. This diversion of resources and intelligence assets would have profound consequences for the mission in Afghanistan. While the United States military maintained a presence, it was a light footprint strategy, that relied heavily on local warlords to maintain order. This allowed the Taliban and al-Qaeda elements to regroup in the lawless tribal areas of Pakistan. They used this sanctuary to recruit new fighters and plan an insurgency that would slowly blade the coalition forces. The seeds of a long and grinding guerrilla war were being sown, while the world's attention drifted elsewhere. Operation Anaconda in March 2002 was the first large-scale battle involving conventional United States forces. Fought in the Shah-i-Kot Valley, it was intended to destroy remaining al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters. The battle revealed the resilience of the enemy, who fought from well-fortified positions in the high-altitude terrain. American soldiers faced intense mortar fire and attempted to secure landing zones under heavy resistance. While the operation was deemed a tactical success, it highlighted the difficulties of fighting in the Afghan mountains. It also demonstrated that the enemy was far from defeated and was willing to stand and fight against superior firepower when cornered. Throughout 2003 and 2004, the United States declared that major combat operations had ended. The focus shifted to reconstruction projects such as building schools, roads, and clinics. The first presidential election in 2004 was hailed as a major milestone, with Hamid Karzai becoming the first democratically elected president. Millions of Afghans turned out to vote, defying Taliban threats of violence. However, corruption began to rot the foundations of the new government. International aid money flowed into the country, but much of it was siphoned off by warlords and corrupt officials. This graft eroded the trust of the Afghan people and created fertile ground for the Taliban to return. The resurgence of the Taliban became undeniable by 2006 as violence spiked across the southern and eastern provinces. The insurgents adopted new tactics, including suicide bombings and the use of improvised explosive devices. These asymmetric weapons neutralized the technological advantage of the coalition forces and instilled fear in the civilian population. The Taliban established shadow governments in rural areas, dispensing swift justice and collecting taxes. The NATO mission expanded to the south, engaging in fierce combat in provinces like Helmand and Kandahar. British and Canadian troops bore the brunt of this renewed offensive, fighting intense battles in the poppy fields and mud-walled compounds. The poppy trade became a major fuel for the insurgency, providing the Taliban with hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. Afghanistan produced the vast majority of the world's opium, and efforts to eradicate the crops often alienated poor farmers. The United States attempted various strategies, from paying farmers to grow alternative crops to forceful eradication. These efforts largely failed, and the drug trade continued to flourish. The Taliban presented themselves as defenders of the farmers against the foreign occupiers and the corrupt central government. This economic reality complicated the counterinsurgency efforts and intertwined the war with the global narcotics trade. By 2008, the situation had deteriorated significantly, prompting calls for a change in strategy. The commanding generals warned that the war was being lost and requested more troops to secure the population. The border with Pakistan remained a porous gateway for insurgents who could attack coalition forces and then retreat to safety. Diplomatic efforts to pressure Pakistan to crack down on these sanctuaries yielded limited results. The frustration within the United States military grew as they watched their hard-fought gains slip away. The war had become a stalemate with no clear end in sight, and public support began to waver. When Barack Hussein Obama took office in 2009, he declared Afghanistan the good war and pledged to refocus American efforts. He authorized a massive surge of 30,000 additional troops to break the momentum of the Taliban. General Stanley McChrystal was appointed to implement a comprehensive counter-insurgency strategy. The goal was to clear insurgent strongholds, hold the territory, and build local governance. This approach required soldiers to live among the population and assume greater risks to protect civilians. The surge brought the total number of foreign troops to over 100,000, marking the height of the international commitment. The Battle of Marja in February 2010 was a major test of this new strategy. Thousands of United States Marines and Afghan soldiers launched an offensive to retake the Taliban stronghold in Helmand province. The operation was highly publicized and intended to demonstrate the effectiveness of the surge. While the military forces successfully cleared the town, establishing a functioning government proved to be much harder. The phrase "government in a box" was used to describe the plan, but the reality was far more complex. Local residents remained skeptical of the government, and the Taliban intimidation campaign continued from the shadows. General David Petraeus took command in 2010 after General McChrystal resigned, continuing the counterinsurgency push. He emphasized the importance of village stability operations and the training of local police forces. The United States poured billions of dollars into training and equipping the Afghan National Security Forces. The hope was that these forces would eventually take over the responsibility for security, allowing international troops to withdraw. However, the Afghan forces were plagued by high attrition rates, illiteracy, and infiltration by the Taliban. Green-on-blue attacks, where Afghan soldiers turned their weapons on their coalition partners, became a terrifying new threat. In May 2011, a pivotal event occurred that changed the narrative of the war. United States Navy SEALs raided a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, and killed Osama bin Laden. The death of the al-Qaeda leader brought a sense of closure to many Americans and raised questions about the continued presence in Afghanistan. With the primary target of the war eliminated, the calls for a withdrawal timeline grew louder. President Obama announced a plan to draw down the surge troops and transition security responsibility to the Afghans by 2014. The war was entering a new phase focused on training and advising rather than direct combat. As the drawdown began, the Taliban sensed an opportunity and increased their attacks on remote outposts. The United States military closed hundreds of bases, consolidating their forces in major population centers. This retreat from the rural areas allowed the Taliban to reclaim territory and influence. The insurgents avoided large-scale battles against American air power, preferring to wear down the Afghan forces. The casualty rate for the Afghan army and police soared as they took the lead in the fighting. The sustainability of the Afghan security forces became a major concern for military planners who doubted their ability to hold the line without American support. The presidential election of 2014 in Afghanistan was marred by allegations of massive fraud and a bitter dispute between the candidates. Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah Abdullah both claimed victory, threatening to plunge the country into civil war. Secretary of State John Forbes Kerry brokered a power-sharing deal, creating a national unity government. This political instability further weakened the state and emboldened the Taliban. The Afghan people grew increasingly disillusioned with their leaders, who seemed more interested in power struggles than in solving the crisis. The gap between the government in Kabul and the rest of the country widened. By the end of 2014, the United States and NATO formally ended their combat mission, transitioning to Operation Resolute Support. The number of American troops dropped to roughly 10,000, focused on training and counter-terrorism. However, the security situation continued to deteriorate rapidly. In 2015, the Taliban briefly captured the northern city of Kunduz, marking their first seizure of a major provincial capital since 2001. The fall of Kunduz was a shock to the system and exposed the fragility of the Afghan forces. American air power was required to help retake the city, preventing a total collapse. A new threat emerged in 2015 with the appearance of the Islamic State Khorasan province. This group, composed of disaffected Taliban fighters and foreign militants, introduced a new level of brutality to the conflict. They targeted civilians, particularly the Shia minority, in horrific suicide attacks. The United States found itself fighting a two-front war against both the Taliban and the Islamic State. This complication added another layer of chaos to an already complex battlefield. The United States military unleashed a massive bombing campaign against the Islamic State, including the use of the massive Ordnance Air Blast Bomb, the largest non-nuclear weapon in the arsenal. When Donald John Trump assumed the presidency in 2017, he initially expressed skepticism about the continued involvement in Afghanistan. However, he eventually authorized a modest increase in troops and delegated more authority to commanders on the ground. The rules of engagement were loosened, allowing for more aggressive airstrikes against Taliban targets. Despite this increased pressure, the stalemate persisted. The Taliban controlled or contested nearly half of the country, and the Afghan government remained dependent on foreign aid. The realization set in that a military victory was impossible and that a political settlement was the only way out. Direct negotiations between the United States and the Taliban began in earnest in Doha, Qatar in 2018. The talks were led by Zalmay Khalilzad, a veteran diplomat who sought to secure a withdrawal agreement. The Afghan government was excluded from these initial talks, a concession that the Taliban had long demanded. This exclusion undermined the legitimacy of the Kabul government and signaled that the United States was looking for an exit. The negotiations were difficult and often stalled by continued violence on the ground. The Taliban used violence as leverage at the negotiating table, intensifying their attacks while talking peace. In February 2020, the United States and the Taliban signed the Doha Agreement. The deal paved the way for a complete withdrawal of American troops by May 2021. In exchange, the Taliban pledged to prevent terrorist groups like al-Qaeda from using Afghan soil to threaten the United States. They also agreed to enter into negotiations with the Afghan government. Critics argued that the deal gave away too much for too little, and that the Taliban had no intention of honoring their commitments. The agreement demoralized the Afghan security forces, who felt abandoned by their most powerful ally. Following the agreement, the United States began to reduce its troop levels significantly. The Taliban refrained from attacking American forces, but intensified their campaign against the Afghan army. They launched a wave of targeted assassinations against journalists, judges, and civil society activists. The violence was designed to silence dissent and prepare the ground for a military takeover. The intra-Afghan talks that began in Doha made little progress as the Taliban stalled for time. They knew that once the Americans were gone, the balance of power would shift decisively in their favor. When Joseph Robinette Biden took office in 2021, he faced a stark choice regarding the war. He could abide by the withdrawal agreement or keep a small force in the country and risk renewed attacks on American troops. President Biden was a longtime skeptic of the war and decided to complete the withdrawal, pushing the deadline to September 11th. He argued that the United States had achieved its original objectives and could not justify staying indefinitely. The announcement sent shockwaves through Afghanistan and the region. It signaled the definitive end of the American era in the country. As the final withdrawal began in May 2021, the Taliban launched a lightning offensive across the country. They focused on seizing rural districts and surrounding provincial capitals. The Afghan security forces, demoralized and lacking air support, began to surrender in droves. Often they negotiated local deals, handing over their weapons and equipment to the Taliban. The speed of the collapse stunned the United States intelligence community, which had predicted that the Afghan government could hold out for months or even years. The psychological blow of the American departure caused the entire security architecture to crumble. By early August 2021, the Taliban began to capture provincial capitals with little resistance. Cities that had been defended for 20 years fell in a matter of hours. Herat, Kandahar, and Mazar-i-Sharif fell in rapid succession. The Afghan government, led by Ashraf Ghani, was paralyzed by inaction and denial. The United States rushed thousands of troops back to Kabul, not to fight, but to evacuate the embassy and secure the airport. The sense of panic grew as the Taliban closed in on the capital from all sides. On August 15, 2021, the Taliban entered Kabul, completing their conquest of the country. President Ashraf Ghani fled the country, effectively dissolving the government. The images of Taliban fighters sitting at the desk of the presidential palace were broadcast around the world. It was a humiliating end to the 20-year project of nation building. Thousands of terrified Afghans rushed to Hamid Karzai International Airport, desperate to escape the returning regime. The airport became the last island of American control in a sea of Taliban flags. The evacuation at the airport was a scene of chaos and desperation that will be etched in history. American Marines and soldiers struggled to control the crowds as thousands of people pushed against the gates. Some desperate Afghans clung to the landing gear of departing aircraft, falling to their deaths as the planes ascended. The United States launched a massive airlift operation, evacuating over 120,000 people in 2 weeks. It was a logistical miracle conducted under the most harrowing conditions imaginable. The soldiers on the ground displayed immense compassion and professionalism amidst the collapse. Tragedy struck on August 26 when a suicide bomber from the Islamic State detonated an explosive at the Abbey Gate of the airport. The blast killed 13 United States service members and nearly 200 Afghan civilians. It was the deadliest day for American forces in Afghanistan in a decade. The attack served as a brutal reminder that the terror threat remained even as the war ended. The fallen soldiers were mostly young men and women, some of whom were mere infants when the war began in 2001. Their deaths added a final tragic chapter to the long conflict. On August 30, 2021, the final United States C-17 aircraft lifted off from Kabul into the night sky. Major General Chris Donahue was the last American soldier to step off Afghan soil, marking the end of the war. The Taliban celebrated with gunfire into the air, declaring total independence. The United States had spent over $2 trillion and lost more than 2,400 service members. The war had also claimed the lives of tens of thousands of Afghan soldiers and civilians. The longest war in American history was over, but the debate over its cost and legacy was just beginning. The aftermath of the withdrawal left Afghanistan facing a humanitarian and economic catastrophe. The international aid that had sustained the economy vanished overnight, and sanctions froze the country's assets. The Taliban struggled to transition from an insurgency to a government facing isolation from the world stage. Women and girls who had gained rights over the past 2 decades faced renewed restrictions on education and employment. The promise of a modern democratic Afghanistan had evaporated, leaving behind a population uncertain of its future. The shadow of the past had once again engulfed the nation. For the veterans of the war, the chaotic end brought a mix of anger, sadness, and reflection. Many questioned whether their sacrifice had been in vain, watching the cities they had fought for fall back into enemy hands. They remembered the friends they had lost and the promises made to the Afghan interpreters who were left behind. The moral injury of the withdrawal weighed heavily on the military community. Yet they also took pride in the fact that they had prevented another major terrorist attack on American soil for 20 years. Their service remained a testament to their duty and courage. The war in Afghanistan serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of military power and the complexities of nation building. It demonstrated that tactical victories do not always translate into strategic success. The conflict highlighted the difficulty of imposing a centralized democracy on a tribal society with a history of resisting foreign intervention. It also exposed the dangers of mission creep, where a focused counter-terrorism operation expands into an open-ended occupation. Future generations of leaders will study this war to understand the perils of entering a conflict without a clear definition of victory. As history turns the page, the legacy of the war in Afghanistan remains etched in the global consciousness. It changed the way the United States fights wars and reshaped the geopolitical landscape of Central Asia. The graves of the fallen and the scars of the wounded are permanent reminders of the cost of the conflict. While the guns have fallen silent, the whisper of time carries the stories of those who fought and died in the mountains and valleys of Afghanistan. It is a story of hubris and heroism, of good intentions and hard realities that will be told for centuries to come.